The morning of August 18, 1944, near the French town of Lunéville, in the rolling farmland east of Nancy. Oberwachtmeister Franz Keller sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther OSV, scanning the horizon through his scissors periscope. The late summer heat made the air shimmer above the engine deck behind him. He'd been a Panzer commander for 2 years, now survived the retreat from Kursk, the grinding battles across Ukraine, and now this desperate defense of France. His crew trusted him. His tank, number 431, had never been penetrated, not once. Through the haze, he spotted movement. American tank destroyers, their distinctive low profiles unmistakable even at this distance. M18 Hellcats, the crews called them. Fast, lightly armoured, mounting the same 76mm gun that was appearing on more and more American Shermans. Keller felt no particular alarm. He'd faced these guns before. Standard American armour-piercing rounds couldn't touch his frontal armour. The mathematics were simple, absolute, comforting. His Panther's glacis plate, 80mm of hardened steel set at 55 degrees, presented an effective thickness of 139mm to any shell striking it head-on. The American 76mm gun, firing its standard M62 ammunition, could penetrate only 109mm at 1,000 meters. The numbers didn't lie. Physics didn't negotiate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Keller gave the order to halt and prepare for engagement. His gunner, Schütze Hoffmann, had already identified the lead American vehicle. The range was perhaps 800 meters, well within killing distance for the Panther's long 75mm Quebel K-42 gun. They would destroy these Hellcats as they had destroyed so many Shermans before them. The loader slammed around into the breach. Hoffmann centered the reticle. The familiar routine of armored combat, executed with the confidence of veterans who knew their machine's superiority. The Hellcat fired first. What happened next would haunt Franz Keller for the rest of his life, though that life would last only 11 more days. The American round struck his Panther's upper glacis plate with a sound like a church bell being struck by a sledgehammer. But there was no deflection, no ricochet, no shower of sparks as the shell skittered away harmlessly. Instead, the projectile punched through 80mm of sloped armour as if it were tin sheeting. The tungsten penetrator continued through the interior, killing his radio operator instantly, severing hydraulic lines and igniting ammunition propellant bags stored beneath the turret basket. Within seconds, Keller's fortress, his mathematically proven sanctuary, was burning. He never had time to understand what had changed. Never learned that the Americans had deployed a new type of ammunition, a round with a tungsten carbide core travelling at velocities his training manuals had never mentioned. Never realized that the absolute faith he'd placed in his tank's invulnerability was based on calculations that no longer applied. 3 members of his crew died in that tank. Keller and his driver escaped with severe burns. The question that would torture him during his brief time in a field hospital, before sepsis claimed him, was brutally simple. How? This is the story of how German Panzer crews discovered that their most formidable tanks, the machines they'd been taught were invincible from the front, could be defeated by a weapon they'd already learned to dismiss. It's the story of the 76mm high-velocity armour-piercing round, and the psychological collapse that occurred when mathematical certainty met tungsten core reality. But more than that, it's the story of how warfare's most dangerous illusion isn't propaganda or false intelligence, it's the comfort of assumptions that were true yesterday but are lethally outdated today. To understand the magnitude of this psychological shock, we must first understand the world German Panzer crews inhabited in the summer of 1944, a world built on layers of experience, doctrine, and engineering reality that had, until very recently, kept them alive. The Panther tank's development began as a direct response to a trauma. In the summer of 1941, German forces advancing into the Soviet Union encountered the T-34 medium tank and were stunned. Soviet tankers were employing a machine that combined thick, well-sloped armour with a powerful 76.2mm gun and excellent mobility. German tankers, equipped with Panzer IIs and early Panzer IVs, found themselves outmatched. The psychological impact rippled up through the command structure. Heinz Guderian himself ordered a full technical assessment. The conclusion was sobering. Germany needed a new medium tank immediately. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther, which entered production in January of 1943. The design borrowed the T-34's most significant innovation, heavily sloped armor. The Panther's frontal glacis plate was angled at 55 degrees from vertical. This wasn't merely an engineering preference, it was a mathematical force multiplier. When a projectile strikes sloped armor, it must penetrate a greater thickness of steel than the actual plate dimension. An 80mm plate at 55 degrees presents approximately 139 mm of effective armor against a shell fired horizontally at the tank's front. This was significantly more protection than the Tiger I's 100 mm of vertical frontal armor. By the time Panthers reached the battlefield in significant numbers in 1944, German Panzer crews had developed what can only be described as a fortress mentality. And this mentality wasn't based on propaganda or wishful thinking, it was built on repeated, verified battlefield experience. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, approximately 38% of the German tanks defending France were Panthers. American tank crews equipped with M4 Shermans mounting 75mm guns learned within days that frontal engagements with Panthers were suicidal. The standard American 75mm M3 gun, firing armor-piercing rounds, could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The tactical implications were immediate and brutal. American doctrine evolved out of necessity. A standard 5-tank Sherman platoon engaging German Panthers had to employ tactics that required extraordinary courage and accepted casualties as inevitable. One section would advance to draw the Panthers' fire, knowing they would likely be destroyed, while the second section attempted to maneuver around the German tank's flanks to strike its thinner side armor. This was not a theory. This was the practical reality of armored combat in France in the summer of 1944. Sherman crews weren't incompetent or poorly trained. They were simply outgunned in frontal engagements. For German Panther commanders, this tactical reality reinforced their sense of superiority daily. They could engage American medium tanks head-on with near impunity. Every frontal engagement that ended with a destroyed Sherman and an undamaged Panther validated the engineering choices that protected them. The psychological advantage was immense. In armored warfare, confidence in your vehicle's protection allows aggressive tactics. If you know the enemy can't hurt you from the front, you can advance, close range, deliver more accurate fire. The Panther crews weren't arrogant without cause. They were responding rationally to repeated evidence of their tank's superiority. But there was a problem developing in the American armored force, one that would ultimately shatter this German confidence. And it began with mounting casualties and an increasingly desperate search for a solution. In July of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy's hedgerow country, American tank losses became unsustainable. The U.S. Army had entered France expecting to face primarily Panzer IVs and a handful of heavy tanks. Instead, they encountered Panthers in numbers that intelligence had not predicted. Statistical analysis of captured German road wheels from just 2 Panther tanks allowed U.S. intelligence to estimate Panther production for February 1944 at 270 units. German records captured after the war showed actual production was 276 tanks that month. The Americans were facing far more advanced German armor than anticipated, and the standard Sherman's 75mm gun was inadequate. The U.S. Army had already developed a solution, or so they believed. Work on a more powerful gun for the Sherman had begun as early as July 1942. The result was the 76mm gun M1, which was essentially a lighter, more compact version of the 3-inch anti-tank gun already in service. The 76mm gun was mounted in a larger turret borrowed from the experimental T-23 medium tank. Production of these upgunned Shermans began in January 1944. By April, the first M4A1 tanks armed with 76mm guns arrived in Britain, ready for deployment to France. But higher-level commanders were hesitant. The 76mm gun had drawbacks. Its high-explosive shell contained only 0.8 to 6 pounds of explosive filler, compared to 1.4 to 7 pounds in the 75mm HE round. Since tanks spent far more time firing high-explosive rounds at infantry positions, bunkers, and au fait, field fortifications than engaging enemy armour. Many commanders viewed the 76mm as a downgrade for the Sherman's primary infantry support role. Additionally, the 76mm gun's muzzle blast kicked up enormous clouds of dust and debris, temporarily blinding the crew and revealing their position. Early production guns lacked muzzle brakes, compounding the problem. Tank commanders sometimes had to dismount and stand away from their vehicle, directing fire by radio through a long wire, just to see where their shots were landing. Most critically, initial testing suggested the 76mm gun still couldn't reliably defeat the Panther's frontal armour. Using its standard M62 armour-piercing capped round, the 76mm could penetrate 109mm of armour at 1,000 metres. Against the Panther's effective frontal protection of 139mm, this was insufficient. The gun could penetrate the Panther's curved mantlet at very close range, perhaps 200 yards or less, but the mantlet's rounded shape meant shells often ricocheted upward or downward, rather than penetrating cleanly. General Eisenhower's frustration was palpable when he learned of this limitation. In July 1944, after reports of heavy American tank losses began flooding up the chain of command, he reportedly said, "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." Despite these limitations, battlefield necessity overrode doctrinal hesitation. In late July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy 102 M4A1 Shermans armed with 76mm guns were rushed to France. They made their combat debut on July 25th, the operation's second day. The breakout succeeded, vindicating the decision to deploy the new gun. But the fundamental problem remained. American tank crews still couldn't reliably defeat Panthers in frontal engagements. What changed everything wasn't a new tank or a bigger gun. It was a projectile that weighed less than 9 kilograms. In the spring of 1944, American ordnance engineers had been working on an advanced ammunition type designated T4. The official nomenclature would later be changed to M93, but soldiers and tank crews simply called it HVAP high-velocity armour-piercing. The concept was revolutionary in its elegance. Instead of using a solid steel penetrator, the HVAP round employed a tungsten carbide core surrounded by an aluminum ballistic cap. Tungsten is extraordinarily dense, 19.2 to 5 grams per cubic centimetre, compared to steel's 7.8 to 5 grams per cubic centimetre. A smaller, denser penetrator travelling at higher velocity could defeat armour that larger steel projectiles could not. The physics were dramatic. The standard M62 round left the 76mm gun's barrel at 792 metres per second. The M93 HVAP round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 metres per second, more than 240 metres per second faster. At 1,000 metres range, the HVAP round could penetrate 178mm of armour. The Panther's frontal glacis, with its effective thickness of 139mm, was suddenly vulnerable. But there was a critical constraint. Tungsten carbide was a strategic material in desperately short supply. Before the war, the United States had imported most of its tungsten from China, with shipping routes contested and competing military demands for tungsten in everything from machine tools to armour-piercing ammunition for multiple weapon systems. Production of HVAP rounds was severely limited. Army in Europe received its first shipment, 2,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition, delivered by air freight. For context, the U. Army had thousands of tanks and tank destroyers in France by this point. 2,000 rounds was a fraction of what was needed. Distribution prioritized tank destroyer battalions, whose primary mission was defeating enemy armor. The average Sherman tank mounting a 76mm gun would receive perhaps 1 or 2 HVAP rounds per month if they received any at all. Some units never saw HVAP ammunition during the entire war. This scarcity would prove to be a factor in the ammunition's psychological impact. German Panzer crews couldn't predict when they might face this new threat. Every 76mm gun became a potential source of lethal uncertainty. The first confirmed combat use of HVAP ammunition occurred on August 18, 1944, near Lunéville in northeastern France. M18 Hellcat tank destroyers from the 704th and 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalions engaged German armor during a counterattack. The results were devastating. The American tank destroyers destroyed 8 Panthers during the engagement without losing a single vehicle of their own. This was unprecedented. Previously, even tank destroyers with their dedicated anti-armor mission had struggled against Panthers in frontal engagements. Now, they were achieving kill ratios that reversed the tactical equation entirely. For the German Panzer crews who survived these encounters, the experience was psychologically shattering. Understand what this meant from their perspective. These were experienced tankers. Many were Eastern Front veterans who'd been fighting in Panthers for 6 months or more. They'd developed elaborate mental models of combat based on repeated experience. They knew exactly which enemy weapons were dangerous and which were not. They knew their tank's protection enveloped the ranges and angles at which they were safe. Every decision they made, how to position their tank, when to advance, when to retreat, how aggressively to engage, was based on these calculations. And suddenly, without warning, the calculations were wrong. There was no gradual adjustment period, no tactical bulletin that reached the front lines warning them of the new threat. The first indication that something had changed was when supposedly safe frontal armor was penetrated. Some crews died instantly, never knowing what killed them. Others, like Franz Keller, survived long enough to experience the disorienting psychological aftermath of having their understanding of armored combat invalidated in an instant. The inability to predict when this new ammunition might appear amplified the psychological impact. If every American tank destroyer and every 76mm Sherman had been equipped with HVAP rounds, German crews could have adjusted their tactics accordingly. They would have known to avoid frontal engagements entirely, to rely exclusively on flanking attacks and ambush positions. But the ammunition's scarcity meant uncertainty. That M18 Hellcat 800 meters away, did it have HVAP rounds or standard ammunition? The Sherman advancing across the field, was it carrying one of those lethal tungsten core projectiles? There was no way to know until engagement, and by then it might be too late. This uncertainty eroded the confidence that had been the Panther crew's psychological armor. In armored warfare, hesitation kills. If you're uncertain whether you can survive a frontal engagement, you hesitate. You seek cover. You wait for better positioning. And in those extra seconds of caution, the enemy gains advantage. The fortress mentality that had sustained German Panzer crews through the desperate fighting in France began to crack. September 1944 brought 2 major tank battles that demonstrated how thoroughly the tactical equation was changing. At Dompierre, France, between September 12th and 14th, the newly formed 112th Panzer Brigade, equipped primarily with Panthers, was decimated by the French 2nd Armoured Division. The Germans lost 34 Panthers in the engagement. French losses were minimal. Just weeks later, the Battle of Aracourt pitted Panther-equipped German forces against the U.S. 4th Armoured Division, part of Patton's Third Army. The American division was still primarily equipped with 75mm Shermans, yet the Germans again suffered catastrophic losses. Multiple factors contributed to these German defeats. The Panzer brigades were newly formed, with poorly trained crews and inadequate tactical coordination. They often stumbled into prepared American positions rather than executing coordinated attacks. German logistics were collapsing, leaving many tanks immobilized by fuel shortages or mechanical breakdowns. But among these factors was a new element. When American 76mm guns engaged Panthers, they were increasingly likely to achieve devastating penetrations. The HVAP ammunition, though still scarce, was beginning to appear in sufficient quantities to matter tactically. German tankers couldn't know the precise supply situation. They didn't know that by March 1945, approximately 18,000 HVAP rounds would reach Europe, with 42% allocated to the 76mm gun and the remainder to the 3-inch gun used in earlier tank destroyers. They experienced only the tactical reality. American guns that should have been harmless were punching through Panther armor with alarming frequency. Consider the psychological journey of a hypothetical German Panzer commander, let's call him Lieutenant Weber, stationed in France in the autumn of 1944. Weber had received his Panther in March and spent 4 months learning its capabilities. He'd knocked out 7 Allied tanks in combat, including 5 Shermans. He'd been hit 3 times, once by a 75mm Sherman, twice by anti-tank guns, and all 3 rounds had deflected harmlessly. His confidence in his tank's protection was absolute because it was based on empirical evidence. In September, Weber's company engaged American armor near Aracourt. The Americans were advancing across open farmland, poor terrain for defense, ideal for the Germans' superior optics and gun range. Weber's company commander ordered them forward to meet the attack. This was standard doctrine. Use the Panther's frontal immunity to close range and destroy the enemy with superior firepower. Weber had executed this maneuver successfully multiple times. At approximately 700 meters, an American tank destroyer fired. The round struck Weber's Panther's lower glacis plate, the slightly thinner armor below the main frontal plate, angled at 60 degrees. Weber felt the impact. He'd been hit before. He knew what a deflection felt like. But this time, there was no deflection. The projectile punched through the armor, travelled through the driver's compartment, and struck the transmission. The tank's engine died. Hydraulic fluid began spraying across hot metal. His driver was screaming over the intercom. Weber ordered immediate evacuation. His crew escaped seconds before the hydraulic fire reached ammunition storage. As they ran across the field toward German lines, Weber looked back at his burning tank and experienced something close to vertigo. Everything he understood about armored combat had just been invalidated. If the lower glacis could be penetrated at 700 meters, then frontal attacks were suicidal. If American tank destroyers now carried ammunition capable of defeating Panther armor, then the tactical advantage Germany had enjoyed for months was gone. This wasn't an isolated psychological crisis. This was happening to Panther, crews across France. The fortress they'd trusted, the mathematical certainty that had allowed aggressive tactics, the confidence that came from technological superiority, all of it was eroding under the impact of tungsten core projectiles. And the worst was yet to come. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler committed his last substantial armoured reserves to a desperate attempt to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive began on December 16th with complete tactical surprise. Panzer divisions smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. For the first few days, it appeared the German armor might achieve a breakthrough. But by this point in the war, the situation regarding American anti-tank capability had evolved significantly. By November 1944, approximately half of the 2nd Armored Division's Shermans were armed with 76mm guns. More importantly, HVAP ammunition was becoming more widely available. Tank crews who had never seen these rounds before were now receiving small allocations, and they were learning how to use them. The tactical data was specific and brutal. With HVAP ammunition, an American 76mm gun could penetrate a Panther's lower front hull plate at 300 yards with near certainty. The glacis plate remained problematic. Even HVAP rounds had only approximately a 1 in 4 chance of clean penetration at 200 yards, largely because the extreme angle increased the likelihood of deflection. But the lower hull plate, the mantlet, and certainly the side armor, were all vulnerable at practical combat ranges. American tank crews had also learned sophisticated techniques for defeating Panthers. One particularly effective method involved aiming at the lower edge of the Panther's curved mantlet. A round striking this area at the correct angle would ricochet downward into the thin roof armor above the driver's compartment. This required skill and often multiple shots, but it worked. Tank crews practiced these techniques, shared knowledge across units, and developed an institutional understanding of Panther vulnerabilities. On December 19th, near the Belgian village of Vielsalm, a Panther emerged from fog directly in front of retreating American forces. The German crew, overconfident in their tanks' capabilities and the chaos of the American retreat, was slow to react. A rearguard Sherman fired first. The American gunner placed his round exactly where he'd been trained to aim, the lower section of the curved mantlet. The shell ricocheted off the mantlet and struck downward onto the driver's hatch, one of the Panther's few truly weak points in the frontal aspect. The driver was killed instantly. The Panther stopped, immobilized but still dangerous. Under continued fire, the crew abandoned the vehicle. This engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it encapsulated everything that had changed since August. The American crew knew exactly where to aim. They fired with confidence rather than desperation. They had internalized the knowledge that Panthers were not invulnerable fortresses but machines with specific, exploitable weaknesses. And they had ammunition capable of penetrating Panther armor even when striking those weaknesses. For the German Panzer forces committed to the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge became a grinding meat grinder that consumed men and machines with appalling efficiency. Fuel shortages, immobilized tanks, Allied air power, when weather cleared, destroyed vehicles by the dozen. American artillery concentrations shattered formations. But among all these factors was the simple tactical reality that American anti-tank capability had improved dramatically. The 76mm gun with HVAP ammunition had closed the firepower gap. Panthers were still formidable, but they were no longer invincible. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Veterans who'd survived years of combat on the Eastern and Western fronts found themselves questioning judgments they'd made automatically for months. Should they advance to exploit an opening, or was that Sherman in the distance carrying HVAP rounds? Should they hold position and engage from distance, or would that give the enemy time to maneuver? The certainty that had allowed decisive action was replaced by hesitation and doubt. By January 1945, after the Bulge offensive had clearly failed, General Eisenhower sent explicit orders. No more 75mm Shermans were to be sent to Europe. Only tanks armed with 76mm guns would be accepted for deployment. This was a dramatic reversal from the previous summer, when many commanders had resisted the 76mm gun due to its inferior high-explosive performance. The necessity of defeating German armor had become paramount, and the 76mm gun with HVAP ammunition was now recognized as essential. Production of HVAP ammunition was increasing, though tungsten shortages meant it never became truly abundant. But the trend was clear. American anti-armor capability was improving, while German tank production was collapsing under Allied bombing and resource depletion. The tactical advantage was shifting irreversibly. What happened to men like Lieutenant Weber, the hypothetical Panther commander whose tank was destroyed near Aracourt? Some survived and were captured, some died in subsequent battles. Many simply disappeared into the chaos of Germany's final months, their fates unrecorded in the historical record, but all of them experienced a profound psychological reckoning. They had entered combat, believing in their tanks the way a medieval knight believed in his armor as an extension of their own survival, a tested and proven protection that had kept them alive through months of desperate fighting. And then, in moments measured in seconds, that belief was shattered by projectiles they couldn't see coming, fired from guns they'd learned to dismiss as harmless. The technical reality of what was happening to them was actually more limited than German crews could know. The HVAP round, for all its revolutionary penetrating power, had significant limitations that would have provided some comfort had they been aware of them. The tungsten core projectile lost velocity much faster than conventional armor-piercing rounds. While standard M62 ammunition maintained relatively consistent penetration capability out to 1,500 yards, the HVAP round's advantage decreased dramatically beyond 1,000 yards. At extended ranges, the lighter tungsten penetrator shed velocity so quickly that it actually performed worse than standard ammunition. Additionally, the HVAP round had a peculiar vulnerability against highly sloped armor. The original T4 version of the ammunition had a greater tendency to ricochet off steeply angled plates than most other projectiles. During autumn and winter of 1944, there were at least 2 production changes to improve the metallurgy of the round. The T4E17 version dominated autumn production, then was replaced by the T4E20 version around the end of the year. This final version was standardized as the M93 in February 1945. But even with these improvements, performance against the Panther's glacis plate, that extremely steep 55-degree angle, remained problematic. A direct hit on the glacis had perhaps a 1 in 4 chance of clean penetration, with the remaining shots likely to deflect or shatter on impact. None of this information reached German tankers in actionable form. They experienced only the results, Panthers being destroyed in engagements that should have been survivable. Randomness was itself a weapon. If German crews had known precisely when HVAP rounds were being used and understood their specific limitations, they could have adapted tactically. They could have avoided close-range engagements, maintained distances beyond 1,000 yards where HVAP effectiveness dropped off, positioned their tanks to maximize the glacis plate's deflection angle. But they had no such knowledge. They faced only uncertainty, and uncertainty in combat is psychologically corrosive. Consider the information environment German Panzer crews operated within during the autumn and winter of 1944. German military intelligence was aware that American tanks were receiving improved ammunition, but the specifics were murky. Captured American technical manuals took time to translate and disseminate. By the time accurate information about HVAP rounds reached unit level, the tactical situation had often already changed. Furthermore, German communication networks were degrading under constant Allied air attack. Radio messages were intercepted, couriers were killed or captured. The flow of reliable tactical intelligence that might have helped crews understand and respond to the new threat was disrupted. What did reach German tankers was anecdotal information from survivors, and survivor accounts are inherently biased toward the dramatic and the threatening. A Panther commander who escaped his burning tank after being hit by an HVAP round would report that American 76mm guns could now defeat Panther frontal armor. But he couldn't know whether he'd been struck by HVAP or whether his tank had been hit in one of its genuinely vulnerable spots by conventional ammunition. The lower hull plate, the mantlet edges, the driver's vision port, all of these were potentially vulnerable even to standard American rounds if struck precisely at close range. This meant the German tactical understanding of the threat was likely more pessimistic than reality warranted. If every penetration was attributed to some new wonder ammunition, the perceived threat expanded beyond the actual HVAP distribution. German crews began to assume that any 76mm gun might be carrying these deadly rounds, even though actual HVAP allocation remained limited throughout the war. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamental to how humans process threats under conditions of incomplete information. When facing an unpredictable danger, we tend to assume worst-case scenarios, because the cost of underestimating a threat can be fatal. A Panther commander who assumed every 76mm gun had HVAP ammunition would fight more cautiously, but he would survive longer than a commander who assumed HVAP was rare and could be ignored. Natural selection, operating at the level of combat tactics, favored pessimism. But tactical pessimism has costs. It means lost opportunities, defensive positioning when offensive action might succeed, retreat when advance was feasible. Across thousands of engagements, these small accumulated hesitations added up to strategic paralysis. German armor, which had previously operated with aggressive confidence, became cautious and reactive. When your doctrine depends on exploiting superior technology to achieve tactical victories against numerically superior enemies, losing confidence in that technology is catastrophic. By early 1945, the tactical situation had evolved beyond the question of HVAP ammunition. The United States was deploying the M26 Pershing heavy tank, armed with a 90mm gun that could defeat any German armour in service. The British were fielding more Firefly Shermans armed with the devastating 17-pounder gun. Even the Soviet forces in the east were deploying IS-2 heavy tanks, whose 122mm guns could penetrate Panther frontal armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. German armour was being outclassed on every front, simultaneously. But the psychological damage done by the HVAP round was disproportionate to its actual battlefield impact. It wasn't the most common round fired at Panthers. It wasn't even the most deadly threat German armour faced. That distinction belonged to Allied air power, which destroyed more German tanks than any ground-based weapon system. The HVAP round's significance was that it shattered the specific psychological confidence that had sustained Panther crews through months of combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to examine what modern military psychologists call unit cohesion under stress. Combat effectiveness doesn't depend solely on equipment or training. It depends critically on the mental state of the soldiers involved. A unit that believes it possesses superior equipment will accept casualties, take risks, and maintain aggressive posture because individual soldiers believe their actions contribute to eventual success. A unit that loses faith in its equipment becomes risk-averse, defensive, and prone to psychological collapse under pressure. German Panzer forces in late 1944 were already under immense psychological strain from multiple sources. They were fighting a defensive war on German soil for the first time since Napoleon. Allied bombing was destroying their cities and killing their families. The Normandy invasion had demonstrated that Germany could no longer defend occupied Europe. The failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had revealed the regime's internal fractures. German soldiers knew, even if they couldn't admit it openly, that the war was lost. In this context, faith in their equipment, specifically in the Panther tank's superiority, was one of the few remaining sources of psychological strength. It was something concrete, verifiable, that could be trusted when everything else was collapsing. The Panther's armour had protected them. Its gun had killed enemy tanks. These were facts, proven repeatedly in combat. When American HVAP ammunition began defeating Panther frontal armour, it removed one of the last foundations of German tanker morale. The contrast with American tank crews is instructive. American tankers in France and Germany knew they were part of a vast industrial and military machine that would eventually grind Germany into submission. They knew that even if their individual tank was destroyed, it would be replaced. If they were killed, their position would be filled by another trained crew. They were part of a system with effectively unlimited resources. This knowledge provided psychological resilience even when facing superior German tanks. Yes, a frontal engagement with a Panther was dangerous. But if you could call in artillery or air support, or simply wait for reinforcements, you would eventually win. The long-term trajectory was clear. German tankers had no such confidence. Every tank lost was effectively irreplaceable. German industrial production was collapsing under Allied bombing. By late 1944, German tank factories were producing perhaps 300 Panthers per month, a respectable figure in isolation, but completely inadequate when facing Allied production of thousands of tanks monthly. Every crew killed represented an experience that couldn't be replaced. Training programs were shortened as manpower shortages intensified. New crews arrived at the front with minimal instruction, sometimes having never fired their main gun before entering combat. In this environment, the appearance of HVAP ammunition wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was confirmation of the inevitable. It was evidence that even the few technological advantages Germany retained were being systematically erased. It was one more indicator that no amount of skill or courage or superior engineering could overcome the material disparity between Germany and its enemies. The testimony of German prisoners captured during and after the Battle of the Bulge reveals this psychological state clearly. When interrogated about their morale and combat effectiveness, many Panzer crewmen expressed a kind of numb resignation. They would fight because they were soldiers, and that was their duty. But they no longer believed in victory. They no longer trusted that their equipment advantages would save them. They were going through the motions of combat while waiting for the inevitable end. Some historians have argued that the German army's combat effectiveness actually increased during its final defensive battles in 1945. German units inflicted higher casualties on advancing Allied forces per German soldier killed than at any previous point in the war. But this wasn't because German morale was high. It was because defensive combat in prepared positions requires less initiative and risk-taking than offensive operations. Demoralized troops can still fight effectively from fixed defenses. They simply cannot conduct the kind of aggressive, opportunistic armored warfare that had been Germany's specialty. The Panther tank remained a formidable weapon system until the end of the war. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could defeat any Allied tank in service at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor, even accounting for HVAP ammunition, was still difficult to penetrate reliably. A well-positioned Panther in a defensive position, with good fields of fire and supporting infantry, was an extremely dangerous opponent. But German armor was increasingly unable to exploit these capabilities because the psychological foundation of confident, aggressive tactics had been eroded. There's a particular irony in how the war ended for German Panzer forces. In the final weeks of April and early May 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and Soviet armies surrounded the capital, hundreds of German tanks were destroyed or abandoned, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they ran out of fuel. Germany's oil supplies had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The elaborate synthetic fuel plants that had kept the Wehrmacht mobile were burning ruins. Panzer divisions that had fought across half of Europe came to a halt simply because their tanks couldn't move. Imagine being a Panther commander in those final days. Your tank is mechanically sound. Your ammunition is adequate. Your crew is trained. But you're sitting immobile beside a road because there's no diesel fuel. And, as you wait helplessly, Allied fighter bombers circle overhead or enemy tanks advance across fields you can see but cannot reach. The fortress you trusted has become a stationary pillbox, and then, as orders come to abandon equipment rather than let it be captured, it becomes an empty shell to be destroyed by your own demolition charges. This is how the Panther's story ended, not in dramatic tank battles where HVAP ammunition decided the outcome, but in pathetic abandonment as the infrastructure that sustained armored warfare simply ceased to exist. The psychological journey from confidence to doubt to resignation was mirrored by the material journey from technological advantage to parity to utter collapse. But our focus remains on that specific moment of psychological shock, that instant, when Franz Keller watched his supposedly invulnerable Panther penetrated by a weapon that shouldn't have been capable of threatening it. Because that moment, replicated across hundreds of engagements throughout late 1944 and early 1945, represented something profound about the nature of modern warfare. In previous eras, military technology changed slowly enough that a soldier could learn his equipment's capabilities and limitations early in his career and have that knowledge remain valid for years. A medieval archer knew what his bow could and couldn't do, and that didn't change throughout his life. A Napoleonic infantryman learned his musket's range and accuracy, and those parameters remained constant. Even in the First World War, while technology advanced rapidly, individual weapon systems remained relatively stable within the war's 4-year span. The Second World War broke this pattern. Technology advanced so rapidly that knowledge became obsolete within months. A German tanker who learned in early 1944 that his Panther's frontal armor was immune to American 76mm guns discovered by late 1944 that this was no longer true. And he had no reliable way to know when the change occurred or how widespread the new threat was. He was operating in an environment of constant tactical uncertainty, where yesterday's proven knowledge could become today's fatal assumption. This is the deeper significance of the HVAP ammunition story. It's not really about a specific projectile type or its technical specifications. It's about the psychological experience of fighting in a war where technological change happens faster than human adaptation can keep pace. It's about the dissolution of certainty in combat and what that does to soldiers' ability to function effectively under stress. Modern military forces have developed elaborate systems to manage this problem. Real-time intelligence sharing, constant tactical updates, after-action reports that disseminate lessons learned within days rather than months. All of these are attempts to keep soldiers' understanding of the battlefield synchronized with rapidly changing reality. But these systems are themselves dependent on infrastructure that can be disrupted or destroyed. And even with perfect information flow, there remains an irreducible human lag between knowing intellectually that a threat exists and internalizing that knowledge at the instinctive level where combat decisions are made. Franz Keller didn't have any of these systems. He had his training from months earlier, his personal combat experience, and whatever fragmentary information filtered down from higher command. When the nature of the threat changed, he had no way to know until the moment that threat killed his crew. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or training. It was an inherent limitation of fighting in an era where technology advanced faster than information could propagate. The post-war fate of the Panther tank is itself revealing. After Germany's surrender, Allied forces captured hundreds of Panthers in various states of repair. The United States evaluated captured Panthers extensively, testing them against American weapons and analyzing their design. The conclusion was that the Panther was indeed an excellent tank, well-armored, powerfully armed, with good mobility when mechanically sound. But it was also over-engineered, difficult to maintain, and dependent on high-quality manufacturing that was impossible to sustain under wartime conditions. France operated captured Panthers for several years after the war, mainly because France's own tank industry needed time to recover. These French Panthers served without distinction and were quietly retired in the early 1950s. The Soviet Union captured hundreds of Panthers on the Eastern Front, but made no attempt to operate them long-term, instead using them for target practice to validate new anti-tank weapons. Britain evaluated Panthers, but never seriously considered adopting them. The tank that had dominated German Panzer doctrine and shaped Allied tactical development simply disappeared from service within a few years of the war's end. Not because it was a bad design, but because the specific circumstances that made it effective, Germany's mid-war industrial capacity, skilled crews, and tactical doctrine emphasizing armored warfare, no longer existed. The Panther was optimized for a style of warfare that ended in May 1945. And what of the HVAP ammunition that so psychologically affected German Panzer crews? The concept of a sub-caliber tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight sabot or ballistic cap proved sound. Post-war ammunition development refined this approach into armor-piercing fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds APFSDS in modern terminology, which remain the standard anti-tank ammunition for tank guns today. The tungsten core concept that first appeared in the M93 HVAP round evolved into the penetrators that armed American tanks throughout the Cold War and into the present era. The 76mm gun itself had a longer combat life than might be expected. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the United States rushed M4 Shermans, armed with 76mm guns, to the peninsula. These tanks faced Soviet-made T-34, 85 seconds operated by North Korean forces. The Americans had learned their lessons from the European theatre. This time, HVAP ammunition was plentiful, tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands. American tank crews had excellent training and superior optics. The result was that 76mm Shermans performed very well against T-34, 85 seconds, often achieving first-hit kills at ranges where the Soviet-designed tanks struggled to return effective fire. This reveals another layer of irony. The ammunition type that German crews experienced as a devastating surprise in 1944 became standard issue by 1950. What had been a scarce and unpredictable threat became routine. The technological advancement that seemed so revolutionary in the context of the Second World War was simply absorbed into normal military practice within a few years. For the men who experienced that technological transition as a combat shock, however, there was no comfort in this long-term perspective. Franz Keller died of infected burns in a German field hospital in late August 1944, never knowing that the weapon that destroyed his tank would become commonplace. Lieutenant Weber, our hypothetical Panther commander, might have survived the war, might have spent years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp before repatriation to West Germany in the 1950s, might have lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a peaceful, prosperous Europe. But he would always remember that moment when his tank was penetrated by a weapon he'd been taught couldn't hurt him. The human cost of these technological transitions is impossible to calculate precisely. How many German tankers died because they advanced with confidence that proved unjustified? How many survived with psychological trauma from having their understanding of combat suddenly invalidated? How many American tankers died in the months before HVAP ammunition became available, killed in desperate flanking attacks against Panthers they couldn't defeat frontally? These questions have no statistical answers because the counterfactuals are unknowable. What we can document is the aggregate result. By the spring of 1945, German armoured forces had been reduced to ineffectiveness, not primarily through combat losses, though those were severe, but through the accumulation of material shortages, fuel starvation, crew quality degradation, and, most importantly, the collapse of the psychological confidence that sustains aggressive armoured operations. The Panther crews who had felt invincible in early 1944 were dead, captured, or so psychologically battered by repeated shocks that they could no longer fight with the initiative and aggressiveness that armoured warfare demands. The final surrender in May 1945 came almost as a relief to many German soldiers. The alternative, continuing a hopeless fight, had become psychologically unsustainable. When you know the war is lost, when your equipment advantages have been negated, when every day brings only more death without purpose, surrender becomes not a failure of courage, but a rational choice. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many German Panzer veterans wrote memoirs or gave interviews that painted their combat experience in heroic terms. They emphasized their technical skill, their courage under fire, their adherence to military professionalism even in defeat. But careful reading of these accounts reveals the psychological scars beneath the martial rhetoric. They describe the constant fear, the mounting sense of futility, the moments when their training and equipment failed them without warning. They were trying to find meaning in experiences that had been, at their core, profoundly meaningless young men killing each other over territory that would change hands regardless, fighting for a regime that was already doomed, dying in service of strategic objectives that could never be achieved. The story of HVAP ammunition and the Panther tank is, in this sense, a microcosm of the entire late-war German experience. Germany began the war with technological and tactical advantages that generated early victories. The Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine, its well-trained troops, and its modern equipment allowed it to defeat larger forces through superior execution. But modern industrial warfare is fundamentally a contest of resources and production capacity. Germany's advantages were temporary. They could be matched and exceeded by opponents with greater industrial depth. Once the Allies closed the technological gap and brought their overwhelming material superiority to bear, Germany's defeat became inevitable. The Panther tank represented Germany's attempt to maintain technological edge, even as its strategic position collapsed. It was an excellent machine, well designed for its intended role. But excellence in tank design couldn't overcome fuel shortages, couldn't replace skilled crews faster than they were killed, couldn't win battles against opponents who could call in artillery strikes and air support whenever threatened. The psychological confidence that Panther crews derived from their tank's superiority was, in retrospect, a kind of denial, a refusal to acknowledge the larger strategic reality that Germany had already lost the war. And the HVAP round, that small tungsten core projectile, was simply the mechanism by which this denial was shattered. It wasn't the cause of German defeat. It was a symptom of the Allies' systematic technological progress and industrial mobilization. By the time HVAP ammunition appeared in combat, The war's outcome was already determined. But for individual German tankers experiencing that first penetration of supposedly impregnable armor, the HVAP round represented the moment when they could no longer sustain the illusion that superior equipment would save them. This is the fundamental tragedy embedded in this story. Not that Germany lost the Nazi regime's defeat was both inevitable and morally necessary. But so many young men on both sides died in the time between when defeat became inevitable and when surrender finally occurred. Franz Keller and the millions like him were fighting and dying for months or years after the war's outcome had been decided by factors industrial production, resource availability, population demographics that individual combat effectiveness could not change. In late 1944, when HVAP ammunition first appeared in combat, Germany had already lost the war. The Normandy invasion was successful. Soviet forces were advancing across Poland toward Germany itself. German oil production was being systematically destroyed. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Italy had surrendered. Japan was being pushed back across the Pacific. No amount of tank armor could reverse these strategic realities. But wars don't end when their outcomes become inevitable. They end when the losing side acknowledges defeat, and that acknowledgement requires psychological acceptance that can take months or years to develop. The systematic erosion of German tanker confidence through technological surprises like HVAP ammunition was part of the process by which that psychological acceptance occurred. Each penetration of supposedly impregnable armor was another small proof that continuing the fight was futile. This might be the truest answer to the question of why the HVAP ammunition mattered psychologically far beyond its actual battlefield impact. It wasn't just that it could defeat Panther frontal armor that was significant tactically, but not strategically decisive. It was that it demonstrated, in immediate and visceral terms, that Germany could no longer maintain technological superiority. If American ordnance engineers could develop ammunition that negated the Panther's armor advantage, they could develop solutions to any German technological edge. The trajectory was clear. Germany's few remaining advantages would be systematically erased by opponents with superior resources and industrial capacity. For a German Panzer commander in late 1944, understanding this trajectory required confronting the reality that his continued fighting was ultimately pointless, that he was risking his life and his crew's lives not to achieve victory that was already impossible, but simply to delay defeat by days or weeks. That kind of understanding is psychologically devastating. It drains combat effectiveness more surely than any ammunition shortage or mechanical breakdown. Some German soldiers managed to maintain fighting spirit through to the end by focusing narrowly on duty and comradeship. They fought to protect their fellow soldiers, to defend their homeland from invasion, to maintain professional military standards even in defeat. But this kind of motivation is fragile. It depends on not thinking too deeply about the larger strategic picture. The moment a soldier fully internalizes that his side has lost and continues fighting only produces pointless death, his will to continue dissolves. The HVAP round's psychological impact on German Panzer crews was that it forced this realization. When your tank, your primary means of survival, your technological edge, your source of combat confidence, can be penetrated by weapons you thought were harmless, you have to confront the reality that your understanding of the war is wrong. And once that specific understanding is invalidated, other assumptions begin to crumble too. Maybe the intelligence briefings about American production capacity weren't exaggerated. Maybe the war really is lost. Maybe continuing to fight really is futile. This psychological cascade from confidence through doubt to resignation is what destroyed German armoured effectiveness in the war's final months, more completely than any amount of combat losses could have achieved. An army that has lost faith in its own effectiveness cannot fight effectively, no matter how good its equipment or training might be. The HVAP round was just one of many factors that produced this loss of faith, but its impact was disproportionate because it struck at one of the few remaining sources of German military confidence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.